This learning is Le'ili Nishmas Broya Bas Chananya, Maseches Terumos, Perek Mishna Aleph. Haterim Kishus V'nimtza Smara. If someone separated a cucumber to be truma and then later was found to be bitter, Avatiach V'nimtza Sarach. Or if someone separated a watermelon to be truma and then later was found to be spoiled, so the halacha is truma. What he separated is a good truma. V'yach Zerayutrim, and the person has to give a second truma. And this is talking about where the person did it by mistake. And the reason why the Chacham required a person to separate truma again, even though they didn't when a person by mistake separated tamei produce to be truma for Torah produce, is because over here the person is close to being amazed, doing it on purpose because they could have checked to see whether it was spoiled or not. The Mishnah continues, Hatayrim chavish shel yayin v'nimtzes shel chemetz. If a person separated a barrel of wine to be truma for other wine, and then later was discovered that it turned into vinegar. Now, wine and vinegar are considered two different types of produce, and a person can't separate truma from one for the other. So the halacha is as follows: Im if it was known that it already turned into vinegar before the person separated the truma, so then ain't it truma, then it's not a good truma. And if it's after the person separated truma that it turned into vinegar, so then I raise the truma, then it is a good truma. And im safek, if it's a doubt whether it turned into vinegar before or after the person separated truma, so the halacha is truma, it's considered a good truma. And the person has to separate truma again because we're unsure when it happened. So if it happened before the person separated truma, then it's not a good truma, and the person has to separate a new truma. And if it happened after the person separated truma, so then the truma is a good truma, and the person doesn't have to again separate truma. And so therefore the halacha is that what the person separated to be truma is considered truma, and also the person has to separate truma again. However, each of them is a suffix, because if it turned into vinegar beforehand, so then the vinegar that was separated is not a good truma. And if it turned into vinegar afterwards, and then the second truma is not a good truma. So each of them is a suffix truma, and therefore harishayna the halacha is that both the first and the second truma, since each of them is a suffix, whether it's a real truma or not. So therefore, even though usually if truma falls into chulin and it's more than 100th of the amount, it is now meduma and it is forbidden to a non-kayin. And even though usually if a non-kayin eats truma by mistake, they need to pay it back and also add a chaimish. Over here, since each of them is a suffix, if either one of them fell into chulin and it's more than 100th of the amount, then it's not meduma. And so too, if a non-kayin ate either one of them by mistake and he pays it back, he doesn't have to add the fifth.